Thank you very much, and thank you for your introduction, Don. I've been thinking about the degree to which, and the volume of discussion about reform, the degree to which we talk about political reform, not least in the McGill Summer School in Blenties, where it is a regular topic of conversation. And I started thinking why it is that we keep reverting to this topic so often. And it seems to me that there are some things we need to think about concerning why reform happens so slowly, or perhaps so little, why we see so little of it at all anyway. And I think that there is actually now a very strong political will to bring about political reform. I think it's acquired a kind of a totemic significance. Nobody can be against reform, right? Given everything that's happened in this country, given the financial disaster that we've experienced, given the shortcomings of the institutional arrangements that we have had in place, given the corruption scandals, all the rest of it, everybody is inclined to think, well, reform is a good thing, we should be having political reform. So there isn't really any disagreement about it. So what's the problem? You know, why are we talking about it all the time, and why are we not seeing more of it? And I think there are two problems. One is about how easy it is to stay with the talking about reform, rather than doing anything. And there are four things I want to consider, four sorts of reasons why this might happen, four ways in which we might see this happening, which I think would be fairly recognisable. But beyond that, I think there is a further set of problems once the commitment to reform is actually undertaken, about actually implementing reform. And these are pretty serious. And I think we need to be, and again, there's four of these, we need to be aware of them if we're not to go dancing around the whole business of simply talking about reform all the time. So the strategies for talking about reform without actually having to do anything about it, like talking the talk without really having to walk the walk, are fourfold, it seems to me. So the first one is straightforward: insincerity. So the idea here would be that once a certain public momentum develops, governments feel that they have to say something about reform. They have to, at least in theory, commit to reform. And I think that I'm not saying for a minute now that our own leaders are in any way guilty of this particular crime, but I think it's a kind of a recognisable temptation that the rhetorical commitment to a course of action might be thought to be enough, and that governments might think they could get away with promising things and not really being quite found out. Well, of course, we know in Ireland, with a clever and informed citizenry who are also really rather sceptical about their political leaders, this might not wash for very long, so that cynicism might set in and might turn out to be a self-defeating strategy. And yet we know that institutions, I'm convinced at least, perhaps rather unlike my colleague John Coakley, that institutions really do matter, and that institutional and legal change really does matter and does in fact change the culture over time. The commitment to reform is important and real. So the next strategy is procrastination. The idea would be that you think about areas that need to be reformed and you say, yes, well actually it's very complicated, we need more information, we'll have an inquiry, we'll set up a commission of inquiry, we'll have an investigation and we'll have a report. Well, that is actually a very good way of kicking an issue to touch as much as anything else. And with any luck, then an election will come up and it'll be off the election cycle. It'll kind of diffuse the pressure for reform for another while, so you don't really have to do anything about it. Then the report comes along and hopefully everybody will have forgotten about it, it can gather dust on the shelf. And when it gathers pace again, you say, well, that old report is a bit out of date. Perhaps we should have an update, a new report. So yes, of course we're committed to change, but very gradual change. Don't rock the boat now, nothing too fast. That's another strategy of not actually having to do anything while seeming to be signed up to the strategy of reform. A third problem is one of prioritising, and I think it's one that we're very prone to in this country. I think it characterises a lot of our debate about political reform at the moment. And the idea here is that it's very difficult to prioritise among all the many things that need to be done. We need to regulate lobbying. We need to do something about parliamentary committees. We need to do many, many different things. So what comes first? So again, this is a strategy of inertia. If everything needs to be done, nothing really needs to be taken very seriously and driven through very thoroughly. And of course, the political temptation is to play to the gallery, to take on things that look like crowd pleasers, things that will be easy, because the important things are likely to be difficult, right? And the difficult things are the ones that it's easiest to put on the long finger. So there's a real problem there about really deciding what matters and committing a lot of political energy to it and driving it through, because it may well be very difficult to do, and you won't get the kudos for actually achieving perhaps the reform, the timescale announced. And the fourth one is that of diffusing responsibility. Okay, you've identified your problem, you've had your investigation, you have your report, and what are you going to do about it? Well, it seems that sadly, once again, the system is to blame. This, I think, is again very recognisable, because if all the evidence, all the reports, all the stories that come out of reports don't actually make it possible to identify which institutions need to be changed, which parts of institutions need to be changed, and who is responsible for things having gone wrong, then it's very difficult actually to mend the things so that similar things don't happen in future. If the system is to blame, then nobody is to blame, and the accountability issue is still left hanging. So what can we say about actually undertaking meaningful reform in action? What are the problems that arise here? And what I'm proposing, of course, is just a framework for debate. I'm not actually saying what things I believe are important or what the top priorities I believe should be. This is very much up to the citizenry at large, but it's very much the ongoing topic of discussion at the summer school. But there are problems that stand in the way of committing to reform, even if you have a very reform-minded government, as we do now. We heard Taoiseach yesterday in his speech talking about, there being no room to avoid change, the dynamic of change, this government with its historic majority committed to political reform and talking about the things they've already achieved, committing to further things. But what sorts of issues stand in the way of really making real changes happen? The first is institutional inertia. And here we can think of this as applying to any aspects of institutions of the state. Ministerial silos with low link-up, the dead centre ruling over all the outlying parts. And institutional inertia is a very real problem if you're trying to undertake political reform. There are ways of doing things that become established. And it's as well to know that if you're going to commit to reform, that it will actually disrupt existing ways of doing things in ways that can be very uncomfortable. And the easiest way to implement reform is simply to ignore all that and just overlay the sort of patina of reform. This is, after all, what happened in the HSE, for example. It's arguably something that we see in the public service over the last 20 years, which has been committed to public sector reform for some 20 years now. And what we see is the appearance of reform without really driving through to very deeply into deep down practices which continue more or less as usual. A second problem is that policies become embedded also. Policies proceed on their tracks. They become, as we say in political science, path dependent. Choices made in the past condition the range of choice you have at the moment, which in turn shapes the way things are going to happen into the future. So the tracks that we're on drive the further evolution of policy. And it's easy to think of examples, for example, in healthcare. I think probably most people in Ireland think that the healthcare system we have is inequitable and inefficient, and that it's not a good thing that access to healthcare when you need it is dependent on how much money you have to spend. People don't think that's fair. But we have a system that incentivises people to take out private insurance, and the hospitals, everybody else, depends on the income coming from private insurance. And so changing to a system where we have universal access based on universal social insurance or some form of universally mandated tax-based funding of healthcare is extraordinarily difficult to achieve from here, and more difficult now than it would have been 30 years ago when we hadn't gone so far down these tracks of dual provision. That's not to say that policies can't be changed. You can switch track. It is possible. It's just that you need to be aware that the levers that you need to move may well be very difficult, very stiff, very hard to move, and that you will disrupt many vested interests, including those of ordinary citizens. People who have private health insurance may have to suffer some disruption in what they have expected to follow from their provisions in order to have something that is better quality in the longer term, better quality for everyone, and a more equitable system for everyone. We may have to pay more taxes into whatever. If we reorganise healthcare, there may be changes that people will find unpalatable. We're working in the health system, all that. So the challenges are significant in actually making the policies work differently. A third problem follows from that of the accountability issue I mentioned a moment ago, and that is that responsibility, if it is to be apportioned where it belongs to the individuals who are responsible for the discharge and implementation of policy, is uncomfortable. Actually holding people responsible for their actions disrupts the existing, you might say, contract of employment, the existing way of thinking about public services and how they work and where a responsibility actually lies. So that the whole sort of work bargain has to be changed and renegotiated and again made more uncomfortable for some people for whom it's easier to diffuse responsibility into the system. And this is something that needs to be taken on, and it will require political strength, commitment, and sometimes you need to take on battles with people who resist it. And the fourth thing, and I think this is really the most difficult one perhaps, is motivating change in the balance of power between our institutions. And the two previous speakers have mentioned this. If one of the biggest problems is the extreme dominance of our executive and the weakness of the legislature, its incapacity to really hold the government to account, and I think that is a major problem, then changing it is something that only the government of the day can undertake. So this is something that is it's something no government will really want to do. It's a case of kind of, oh yes, make us virtuous lords, but not quite yet, not while we're in power, because we enjoy having the full range of powers available to us and pushing through the policies in the way that we would best like. And so there's a kind of turkeys voting for Christmas syndrome. So why would governments do this? Well, we hear all the rhetoric from the government that is in power now because they believe that it is going to be electorally popular, and because there are enough people telling them that it will improve the quality of governance. But we heard from Deputy Tobin, thank you, that this comes up hard against government preferences when it comes to things like changing standing orders. The Abbey Laura referendum, I believe, can't be the end of the matter, but there are huge issues and real obstacles to be overcome there. So the reform effort, of course, has been engaged in. There is plenty of reform going on, but perhaps some of the areas in which it's been most effective, especially public sector spending reviews, have been driven very hard by external supervision. The things that we're most in charge of ourselves are the things that are easiest to let slip. It is an uphill journey all the way, and I think we can probably expect to be still talking about political reform in the McGill Summer School 2013. So all that remains for me now simply is to engage in a shameless act of self-promotion and to remind you what the cover looks like of this book, which I edited solely, and which is on sale here, and I encourage you to buy it, please. Thank you.